There's been a rather interesting theme going on in recent years. It's that eerie happening where a sequel to a much beloved movie or some other kind of fiction, one that should have been an easy layup, falls flat on its face without reason. You see, people react more negatively on initial impressions nowadays when a follow-up to a highly beloved series gets announced, and that's partly the fault of the entertainment industry at largely failing to instill any sort of faith in its customers that it can deliver something worth their ever-weakening dollar. Now, part of the reason we see so many bad sequels nowadays is because studios are reluctant to fund anything that isn't a sequel or a remake. This, coupled with the lack of talent in Hollywood at the moment, has led to a lot of very disastrous additions to series that had already filled out their entire storyline. And now that brings us to the topic of today's video, which is a phenomenon I've taken to calling the Boruto effect, whether you want to use that name or not. If you're wondering about the name, it stems from my loathing for the sequel to one of my favorite animes of all time, Naruto Shippuden. And it was the first series where I really sort of observed these phenomenons, and that's why I started calling it that. Now, some acquaintances of mine here on YouTube, people I have done streams with, shout out to RG Energy and Roland, have given it a completely different name, one that is a little bit more comprehensive and related to the topic. The sequel effect. But because this is my video, I'm going to continue to call it the Boruto effect, so cope and seat. So what exactly do I mean when I refer to the Boruto effect? Well, it's what occurs when a story is dragged out beyond its logical end, altering existing story material, whether directly or indirectly, to graft on additional story content. Basically, it's when the story has run its logical course and has pretty much tied up every loose end within its world, but the studio or writer feels the urge to try and milk some more life out of the product rather than leaving it on a fine ending or shifting to another aspect of the story. And because the overall story is so well wrapped up, it becomes hard to develop new content within the existing parameters, and thus the world begins to fall apart as they try to expand it more and more. The notable symptoms of the Boruto effect are as follows. Firstly, the destruction of characters. Secondly, copying of previous plot points. And thirdly, the ultimate destruction of writing and retconning of the series. The first symptom of the Boruto effect to cover is the butchering of popular characters. This happens because the writers have decided that the old characters have lived out their story long enough, and thus have no more content to explore. Their story is finished, and thus they need to be relegated to the sidelines so that a fresh new face ready for a character arc is ready to take over. Oftentimes, though, this is done through rather unpopular means. The first method, and usually the most common one, is character assassination. Writers go out of their way to show how a previously badass hero of a series fell from grace and became a shell of them former selves. They have to rip the previous hero apart in order to make room for a new one. And that's what we see with the Lucasfilm sequels done under Kathleen Kennedy. Han Solo is relegated to a bad dad who's incompetent and gets stabbed. Luke Skywalker becomes a sad, broken old man hiding away from the world, drinking alien milk straight from the titty. Indiana Jones gets turned into a sad, broken old man who's a bad dad and depressed because he's getting divorced. Now, this method is usually accompanied by some need to replace the established male characters with a newer, younger, and empowered female character as well, i.e. the choice is often made based on ideological lines. It's rather nefarious that this is allowed to happen purely to prop up a message, and as time has shown, it leads to very poor results. The second method for getting a previous and well-established character out of the way is to nerf them as hard as possible in order to make them irrelevant in the story. You see this in the anime Boruto, in which both Naruto and Sasuke take hits to their power levels to justify the next generation of shinobi having a role to play in the story. This is usually done because a writer can't logically justify going over the top of the apex of his creation, and he has to drag them down to make them weaker. So it's more feasible when the new protagonist inevitably has to go up against an enemy far too powerful for the original main characters. This one is usually less vindictive and simply shows a lack of creativity or a level of laziness in writing that just shouldn't be allowed. And because it lacks that ideological motivation, I feel like this one actually makes me more angry, because it's just an outright refusal to care. Again, this is all done so that the old protagonist can be replaced with a fresh face that can seemingly start the series anew. Rather than using some sort of creative scenario that puts the original main characters in a tough spot, the writer chooses instead to destroy the existing power scaling and replace it with something new. Let's look specifically at the Naruto series here. From the end of Naruto Shippuden to the beginning of Boruto, the two big characters in the series, the titular character Naruto and his rival Sasuke, take massive nerfs to their power levels. Where once the two of them were virtually gods among the shinobi, they seem to have come back down to the realm of mortal men. And this is done to force a scenario in which Boruto and Kawaki are needed in order to fight the Otsutsuki, rather than Naruto and Sasuke, the two who previously banished Kaguya at the end of the Fourth Great Ninja War. There was a rather easy way around this that didn't involve nerfing the two characters. Firstly, Sasuke wanders the world monitoring the shadows for any signs of trouble. Having him out of the way is an easy task. Just keep him on the hunt for the Otsutsuki working behind the scenes, and he's out of the picture. And with Naruto, he's already the Hokage and a symbol of peace between the shinobi nations. Loading him up with administrative and diplomatic work would be an easy way to keep him out of the picture while still keeping him relevant as far as power scaling goes. Meanwhile, you could have Boruto recklessly stumble upon some strange happenings that lead him deeper and deeper into the plottings of the Otsutsuki. Meanwhile, Naruto and Sasuke run up against enemies who have adapted to their strengths and prove difficult to beat even at full power, and Boruto's refusal to sit out actually helps shift the situation as he proves to be more capable than expected. But rather than that, and keeping our favorite characters as actual badasses, it was decided that the characters needed to be nerfed because it was the easiest and simplest solution to the issue. Of course, the problem with Naruto Shippuden's characters taking hits in Boruto doesn't end there. You see a lot of the same with many of the legacy characters not being up to their former glory, which is just outright disappointing. And we have plenty of other franchises that have done almost exactly the same thing. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, the MCU, Terminator. I could go on, but I won't. In some of these, say Star Wars or Indiana Jones, or even the MCU, you could have had truly awesome mantle-passing moments complemented by well-written storytelling, such as Steve passing his shield on to Bucky. The most logical decision, and one that reflects the dynamic between them, one that I may do a video on later. But that wouldn't fit the needed narrative at play in the writing world. I could talk about how Helena in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny could have been an overly arrogant character who gets in over her head, is then saved by Indy. Indy goes on to mentor her, and she ultimately takes up his role in protecting priceless artifacts from falling into the wrong hands, as he's too old to carry on such a task anymore. And I could loop this repeatedly, but I will spare you. The point is that the writers felt it necessary, whether due to lack of creativity or due to ideological need, to butcher and deconstruct the previous generation of heroes just to prop up a new generation on false grounds, so they could lend credit to their own creations as being better than the last. They have no way around the gravitas of the original heroes, so in order to make their new story even somewhat relevant, they have to tear down the old ones. They lack the skill to bring things up to the previous level, so they have to tear everything down to theirs. Nowhere is this more evident than the attempted adaptation of Grand Admiral Thrawn in the Ahsoka series. Thrawn was supposed to be a menacing, cunning, highly intelligent, and ruthless general who single-handedly put the New Republic on the brink of destruction. That was how he was written in the books, anyway. What Dave Necrofiloni gave fans instead was a bumbling, incompetent fool who failed his way into success. He lacked any sort of threatening aura or grand cunning. Why? Because the writers lacked the talent to, 1, make him highly intelligent, because a character can only be as intelligent as the person writing them. And 2, have the hero still overcome him, because again, characters can only be as intelligent as the people writing them. Thus, they degraded the character in order to add more content, which in and of itself is an affront to the character, because there are 3 novels that presented him as exactly the kind of villain people love. Someone with gravitas, who's actually threatening, and is an overwhelmingly awesome villain. But back to the point. The second symptom of the Boruto effect is the return of old enemies and the copying of previous plot points. Because there remains a need to keep some ties with the old series, sometimes you will see a series bring back old enemies who were defeated by previous heroes, or just straight up rip the plot out of the old movies. Look at the way Rise of Skywalker brought Palpatine back, or how Boruto dragged the Otsutsuki out of the dustbin, even though these were arguably the worst aspects of Naruto, or how The Force Awakens created a bigger, badder Death Star. This is often the result of the lack of direction that comes with trying to graft on additional content to a story that has reached the end of its narrative cycle. Without the proper endgame of the original series, the writing is prone to meandering about with no real goal and ultimately settling on just dealing with some supposed unfinished business. This has been one of many problems with the MCU post-Endgame, and exemplifies what happens when you overrun your narrative limits. It not only replaced a lot of existing characters with more unlikable derivatives of the original, but it lacked any significant direction in the fourth phase to keep its storytelling in a coherent order. Ultimately, it implemented Kang, but that wasn't going to help as people had already tired out and Kang had never really succeeded in the comics to begin with. But I digress. Star Wars and Boruto are better examples of this. Star Wars failed to look at the many stories available to them and instead chose a directionless rebranding of old enemies. Another Skywalker as a villain, Stormtroopers rebranded a bit, an uncompelling Empire returned for a second go. Boruto had a few plot points that it actually could have addressed properly, like the existence of an Uchiha Hokage that would have made the story complete. But it dragged the Otsutsuki back into the story even after being a part of the final battle that was largely criticized for just that, the Moon Demons. The Otsutsuki issue is a huge problem as well, since it broke the power scaling of the world by bringing even more godlike beings than just Kaguya, and began to deal with a whole different issue than what the original Naruto and Naruto Shippuden series actually dealt with. The final symptom is a result of the two previously mentioned symptoms. The ultimate unwinding of the original narrative structure, corruption of messaging, and breakdown of power scaling to a meaningless point. The results of trying to add dead weight to the end of the series is that it needs to be stitched on in a way that doesn't often result in a natural transition. It requires retcons, character assassinations, and adding completely new bullshit into the mix of the story that never needed to be a part of it at all. Naruto goes from being a commentary on the human condition leading to endless cycles of violence to a battle against interdimensional moon demons trying to suck the world dry. It loses the impact of its original story, and while it certainly does deliver some insanely hype moments, Momoshiki, doesn't live up to the standards set by the stories of its predecessors. It ultimately copies the final act of Shippuden for its big moment and thus doesn't come off as anything more than an exciting fight. Star Wars loses any meaning in the battle between good and evil, and powers become irrelevant later on as more and more is grafted onto the Star Wars brand. It goes from having a villain who turned to the dark side due to years of manipulation and accumulation of trauma and negative emotion, to having a villain who's nothing more than a whiny wannabe who, admittedly, does kind of look cool. The MCU actively flayed all its storytelling up to Endgame by creating the D+ series Loki that relegated every action in the MCU to nothing more than a forced scenario at the hands of Kang. And all this ultimately resulted in a bland, meaningless mess that fails to capture the magic of the original creation. It lacks the same meaning and impact as the original. Characters that you once loved and were inspired by no longer have the same glow to them that they used to, and they only even got included in the project as a means to prop up a new character nobody wanted or even likes, as well as to make you feel nostalgic for the things of the past. The story you once loved and revered has been twisted into a mockery of its former self. Thus, the life cycle of the modern sequel remake project comes to an end. I first noticed this phenomenon when I finally finished Naruto and attempted to watch Boruto. The issue I found was that the characters I had once loved were no longer the same. Naruto had been nerfed and was basically treated as a lame loser dad, and Boruto came off as a spoiled, annoying brat who was unjustly full of himself and was constantly talking crap to everyone. In some ways, it did reflect the young Naruto, but not in the good ways that actually made his character charming. And Sarada was an Uchiha with glasses. Seriously, how do you have a clan whose hyper-perceptive eyes are their significant trait, and then give one glasses? But I digress. It was hard, especially with the unneeded amount of filler that came with the series, to watch this one. I eventually gave up because watching all the great characters I had once loved get turned into shadows of them former selves was too hard. All the while, the story failed to capture anything that felt like the original motif of Naruto. Thus, I dubbed this the Boruto effect, the result of dragging on a story past its logical narrative conclusion. Often done out of spite, greed, or just plain hubris, this generally results in poor performing additions to a series that already concluded its significant narrative points. Now, not every series that experiences this will show the exact same symptoms, but this general outline for the results of sequels being grafted onto a series is my observation of everything we've been getting out of the entertainment industry lately. The slow, sad deaths of our favorite stories driven solely by the hubris of bad writers and the greed of corporations. Perpetrated by writers who could care less and don't have the skill to do what they are doing, and defended by critics and media talking heads who are paid off by corporations to do exactly what they're doing. And hey, if you've made it this far, thank you. It's the end of the video now, and I really appreciate that you gave me all this time to listen to what I had to say. If you want more of this, please consider liking and subscribing, because those simple and free actions do really help me. But that's about all I can ask of you, and if you have any thoughts, you are completely welcome to dump them down in the comments. Anyway, I hope you have a great day, and I will catch you in the next one. Later.